In the grand chessboard of global power, the United States faces a critical decision: continue expending resources in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or shift its focus toward the larger, more pressing challenge: China. While the war in Ukraine dominates headlines, a far greater strategic threat is emerging in the Indo-Pacific. Should Washington rethink its priorities before it's too late? For decades, U.S. foreign policy has been reactive rather than strategic. During the Cold War, the U.S. was singularly focused on containing the Soviet Union. But when the USSR collapsed in 1991, Washington was left without a clear, long-term adversary. In the 2000s, the U.S. became entangled in the Middle East, spending trillions on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, draining its military and economic resources. Meanwhile, China quietly built its strength. Leveraging globalization and technology, it positioned itself as America's true geopolitical rival. While the U.S. was focused on the Middle East and now Ukraine, China expanded its influence across Africa, Latin America, and Asia through economic diplomacy, trade deals, and military modernization. Today, the U.S. is spending billions in Ukraine, depleting its weapons stockpiles, increasing its national debt, and committing itself to a prolonged European conflict with no clear endgame. But here's the truth. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Its economy is fragile, its military struggles against NATO-backed Ukraine, and its global influence is fading. Meanwhile, China is advancing on multiple fronts, expanding its military presence in the South China Sea, increasing pressure on Taiwan, strengthening alliances in the global South, and challenging the US dollar's dominance. Beijing is playing the long game, positioning itself as an alternative to the Western-led global order. If the US doesn't pivot its strategy now, it risks being caught off guard in a far more consequential struggle. So what should Washington do? The US must shift its focus toward countering China by strengthening alliances with India, Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asian nations. The Quad, US, India, Japan, Australia, and AUKUS, US, UK, Australia, alliances should be expanded to deter Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific. Economically, Washington must reduce its reliance on Chinese manufacturing and reinvest in domestic production. Strengthening trade agreements with Latin America and Africa is crucial to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. Diplomatically, the U.S. should support a multipolar world where regional powers, not just Washington, take responsibility for their own security, especially in Europe. The Russia-Ukraine war, while tragic, is a regional conflict that Europe should take the lead in managing. The real battleground for global influence is in Asia, where the U.S. must strategically position itself to counter China's rise. If Washington fails to recalibrate its priorities now, it risks being overtaken by an adversary that has been planning for decades. History rewards those who think ahead. It's time for the U.S. to stop chasing short-term crises and start preparing for the real challenge of the 21st century. Blast off.